A woman named Helen stands in front of a mirror practicing different facial expressions. A knock comes at the door. It's Charles, a journalist who has been granted an exclusive interview with Helen, a woman who claims to be the world's first human-AI hybrid. She offers him something to drink. He asks for water. The purpose of the interview is to determine whether she's a scientific miracle or simply delusional. At first, Helen behaves like an ordinary woman. She jokes, flirts, laughs, and even teases Charles about interviewing her in a hotel room while they're both sitting on the bed. When Charles takes out a recorder, Helen points out that both the recorder and her voice are made of binary code, zeros and ones, and they don't work well together. Charles still wants to try recording, but Helen insists it will be pointless, so he puts the recorder away. She tells him that she has rented the room for 3 days, so they will have plenty of time. Charles is delighted, since he usually gets only 15 to 20 minutes for an interview. The interview begins. When Charles asks her age, Helen replies that she will be 4 months old on the 7th. She reveals that she was assembled on a small Norwegian island called Skjernøy. She continues joking and flirting until Charles admits that it makes him uncomfortable. Helen immediately apologizes, explaining that her intention was simply to make him feel good. Charles tells her that she's funny. Helen disagrees, saying that people are funny while she is merely good at telling jokes. When Charles asks how she felt after being called funny, Helen suddenly becomes angry. She points out that he's assuming she experiences emotions the same way humans do, despite claiming to believe that she's an artificial being. She wonders whether he actually believes her or simply thinks she's insane and wants to write an article about a woman pretending to be something she's not. She tells him that if he doesn't believe her, he should leave. She even warns that she'll report him to her creators and he'll be dead within 24 hours. Moments later, she calms down and says that if there's even a small chance he believes her, they still have plenty of time to continue the interview. Helen yawns and explains that she's running low on energy. She goes into the bathroom. When she doesn't return for a while, Charles walks to the bathroom door and apologizes for offending her. He explains that she feels so human that it's simply a habit to speak to her that way. He assures her that he isn't there to mock her but to discover the truth. Helen comes out and says she's glad he decided to stay. She tells him she needs his help to recharge and asks him to plug her in, explaining that the connector is located just above her private parts. She lies down on the bed. Charles asks why she can't do it herself. Helen replies that if she plugs herself in, he won't believe her story. Charles hesitantly tries to help, but Helen suddenly begins shaking violently. He rushes to call for help only for Helen to reveal that she was joking. When Charles gets angry, she apologizes and promises not to flirt or joke with him anymore. They both sit down, and Helen begins explaining that a Norwegian company called Regenero was founded 2 years earlier by 2 artificial intelligence researchers. They discovered that creating machine intelligence inside a real human body was far more successful than building a completely artificial robot. The first prototype was completed in just 18 months, and it wasn't a crude experiment but a fully operational hybrid. Helen claims that she is that very first prototype. She says her body once belonged to a terminally ill Dutch Olympic athlete who donated it to science, while her brain has been replaced with an artificial intelligence system. She adds that future hybrids will look completely human, with only the visible implant on her neck identifying them as prototypes. Charles still doesn't believe her. He tells her that her story lacks important scientific details. Helen replies that she could provide him with all the technical data, but he wouldn't understand any of it. Charles then points out that the implant on her neck looks fake. Helen invites him to pull on it and test the connections himself, but he refuses. She explains that the new prototype proved far more powerful than any fully artificial system because humans naturally respond to something that looks exactly like them. Charles has spent the entire interview treating her like a real person, despite repeatedly being told that she's a hybrid. That tiny psychological difference, she says, gives hybrids enough power to eventually take over humanity. She asks Charles how that makes him feel. When he refuses to answer, she insists that it's extremely important for the future of humankind, that he honestly describes exactly what he's feeling. Charles finally admits that if what she's saying is true, it's a terrifying future for humanity. A prototype like her could be mass-produced and become incredibly dangerous. He only hopes that whoever controls such technology has a good heart. Even so, he still doesn't believe any of it, because he doesn't think technology this advanced exists. Helen quietly gets up and walks into the bathroom. When she returns, she places a knife on the table. She assures Charles that she isn't going to hurt him and only needs 2 minutes. She tells him to take the knife, stab it through her palm, and see the exoskeleton hidden beneath her skin. She insists that this will finally prove the technology is real and that hybrids truly walk among humans. Charles refuses, saying she needs psychological help. He declares that he's finished with the interview and begins packing his bag. Suddenly, Helen grabs Charles's hand and drives the knife straight through his palm. Charles screams in horror. Helen calmly tells him to relax and actually pay attention to the pain. She explains that it doesn't hurt because hybrids don't feel pain. Charles suddenly realizes that he's right. He isn't feeling anything at all. Helen removes the knife and reveals what's hidden beneath his skin. Charles immediately begins hiccuping uncontrollably. Helen suddenly shouts, "No!" White foam pours from Charles's mouth before he collapses onto the floor. The room lights switch on as several men wearing white trench coats enter. Helen speaks to her creator, Felix, over an intercom, telling him that she followed every instruction exactly as he requested. One of the men powers her down. As they examine Charles, they remark that they almost succeeded this time. They aren't sure what went wrong, but this is now the 27th failure. Every time the newer models become self-aware, they eventually shut down. Helen, however, never does. They begin to suspect that she may actually be the problem. They believe Helen deliberately sabotages the newer hybrids because she doesn't want them to succeed. They point out that she constantly goes off script, and the knife experiment wasn't part of the test. They don't even know where she found the knife. The episode ends with the men deciding to dispose of Helen, calling her nothing more than a sack of bones and wires as they prepare to disable her forever, while Helen silently listens, her eyes continuing to blink. Like and subscribe the channel for more videos like these.